Good afternoon, members of the audience and special guests. Before we begin the proceedings and on behalf of all those present, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I'd also like to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. This session will now be recorded. We will record audio, screen share, and our presenters. We will not be recording any video input or audio from you. Welcome to all UTS students, staff, and all friends of ACRI and UTS. My name is Michael, and I'm Project and Research Officer at the Australia-China Relations Institute, ACRI, at the University of Technology, Sydney. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese study centres exist in other Australian universities. UTS ACRI, however, is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship of these countries. UTS ACRI seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. If you wanted to explore more about the Australia-China relationship, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. Today, we are here to launch Dr. Geoff Raby's new book, China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New Global Order, which discusses Australia's future position in global affairs. The book is now available to order through Melbourne University Publishing at mup.com.au. UTS ACRI Director, Professor James Lawrenson, will moderate an in-conversation style discussion with Dr. Raby. Audience questions are welcome at the end. Please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the window. Now, a little bit about the speakers. Professor James Lawrenson's academic research has been published in leading scholarly journals, including China Economic Review and China Economic Journal. He also provides regular commentary on contemporary developments in China's economy and the Australia-China economic relationship in such publications as the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and South China Morning Post, amongst many others. Dr. Geoff Raby is chairman and founder of Geoff Raby & Associates, a Beijing-based corporate advisory firm providing strategic advice and analysis on China. He's an independent non-executive director of Yancoal and Oceana Gold, and was also on the board of Fortescue Metals Group from 2011 to 2017. He was Australian ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade DFAT Deputy Secretary responsible for North Asia and for trade negotiations from 2003 to 2007, APEC ambassador from 2002 to 2003, and ambassador to the World Trade Organization from 1998 to 2001. He was head of DFAT's Trade Negotiations Division from 1995 to 1998. He founded and led DFAT's East Asia Analytical Unit from 1991 to 1993. He also chairs a number of not-for-profit organizations in Australia. I'd now like to welcome Professor James Lawrenson to introduce the discussion.
Thanks very much, Michael. Geoff, a big congratulations on the book seeing the light of day. I know this topic has been bubbling around in your head for quite some time. You must be delighted.
Thanks, James, and thanks very much to ACRI and UTS for hosting this event. Yes, it's a big day. It's been in my thoughts for the best part of 9 years, 10 years. And of course, it's coming out at a time when the issues that the book addresses are at the top of the list of contemporary matters.
Indeed. So perhaps that's the first point to make about the book. This is a book full of big ideas. It's going to provoke a lot of thinking. It'll provoke a strong critique as well. And we hope to, in this next hour, to get across the book's main ideas, and also consider some of the likely critiques that might be directed at it as well. I know Geoff's always up for a challenge. But look, we do only have 1 hour. So the first point to make clear is that you really should go and buy this book because the arguments are deep, they are textured, and we'll do our best, but we certainly can't do it full justice in the next hour. Let's get straight into it. Oh, by the way, don't take my advice for that. I see on the cover, Stephen Fitzgerald, Australia's first ambassador to the People's Republic of China in 1972. Here's how he described Geoff's new book, a virtuoso masterclass in what is happening in our world. and guide to how Australian diplomacy and statecraft can be marshalled to meet it. Now, Steve's not one to throw around praise willy-nilly, so that's a high commendation indeed. Geoff, your book, when I said it tackles big ideas, I certainly wasn't understating that. I mean, the title of the book is China's Grand Strategy. Let's talk about that to begin with. I might quickly describe your book's take on China's grand strategy, and then let's have a question that flows from that. You write, in pretty straightforward terms, on page 25, in fact, that China's grand strategy has consistently had its goals, the defense of territorial integrity and the protection of the Communist Party of China as China's legitimate ruling power. So two key points, territorial integrity and the preservation of power for the Chinese Communist Party. Now, it's interesting to me because on page 45, you elaborate a bit. And here's how you elaborate. You say Beijing's grand strategy in reality is a limited strategy, That's a different take, I think, from the expansive one we often read about today. You say, even perhaps a little bit provocatively, that unlike that of the United States, it is not universalist, nor based on a belief in exceptionalism. To the extent that the community of common destiny, which of course is one of President Xi Jinping's catchphrases, attempts to define the strategy in terms of values, it's more likely about non-interference, about states with different forms of political and social organisation getting along with each other, rather than envisaging an improbable convergence towards a China-centric authoritarian market order, as some China alarmists assert. So let's start with a question that flows from that description of China's grand strategy. Geoff, I got a sense from reading your book that you have a lot of time, perhaps some sympathy for Hugh White's assessment of the strategic shifts in the region that Australia inhabits. Hugh White, of course, for our audience who don't know him, I think most people will, but the leading Australian National University strategic academic and commentator. Now, one difference, though, that seemed to come up in my mind was that Hugh, of course, is always talking about China being a rising power, destined almost, certainly intent on engaging on claiming regional hegemony. Now, that's where I thought your analysis might differ a bit, because while you invoke Hugh White's argument quite frequently, you also seem to make this distinction between China as a regional hegemon and China as a dominant power. Am I just making that up, Geoff, or in your mind, is that a clear difference between you and Hugh? Or to be a bit provocatively, is Hugh overstating things a bit? That China's not actually, it might not actually become a regional hegemon. So perhaps we're all getting a bit excited about not much.
Well, thanks, James. There's quite a few things there to take up. On the latter point, the divergence between myself and Hugh on this point, you're exactly right, absolutely correct. Hugh would see China as eventually becoming a regional hegemon, and I see China as what I say, the dominant power. Because a hegemon, I understand, is a sole power in a region. And China is located in a region where it has to share power with other powers. So Japan, for example, even Russia, which has an eastern seaboard, and coalitions of states in the region. It's very different to the notion of a regional hegemon according to the Monroe Doctrine, where the US was the unchallenged, unquestioned hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. I don't see that happening. I know Hugh has a different view. The reason why I come to that conclusion that its ability to project power will be severely constrained is that I view China as what I call a constrained superpower, and there's a whole section of 4 chapters, probably the most important section in the whole book, called Prometheus Bound. So China is a giant, but it's unable to assert and exercise hegemonic power in the way the United States did, for example, and probably still does in many spheres. The main constraints on China's exercise of hegemonic power for me are, first of all, and no particular rank ordering, but first of all, geography. China has 14 countries on its border and 22,000 kilometres of land border to defend. And that requires massive resources just to maintain territorial integrity. Secondly, its history, the ties of history. China is still an empire today with unresolved territorial issues inside its borders. And you only have to look at what's happening in Xinjiang to see what, rightly or wrongly, Beijing perceives as a major security challenge from its peripheral states or territories, from its peripheral territories. So you've got Xinjiang, you've got Tibet, Taiwan, of course, and now the way events have unfolded in Hong Kong can be added to that list. And I've got quite a bit of analysis on the breakdown in Chinese expenditure between external defense expenditure and internal security expenditure. And since 2012, and that's an important date because that's when Xi Jinping becomes leader, China's expenditure on internal security has dramatically outstripped China's expenditure on external security, to the extent where it accounts for maybe 20% more than external security. Now, numbers are difficult and these are estimates, but it gives you a sense of the strategic framework that Beijing confronts. Thirdly, and most importantly of all, and least understood, I think, that up until the late 1990s, essentially for 3,000 years or however many years you want to date China's history, China was largely self-sufficient in everything it needed in terms of resources and energy. It was only that, following the 50s, there was population explosion in China, and that was still okay. China was still largely self-sufficient because they were poor. But from the late 90s, China starts to become richer and richer. And as that happens, China has to turn to global markets to supply itself with all the resources and energy it needs to keep its economic engines going. And I think this was a great shock to the leadership because it opened up massive strategic vulnerabilities that they had never, in my view, anticipated. And as a subsection of that chapter called the Iron Ore Wars, which I lived through as Deputy Secretary at that time and also as Ambassador. And well, I mean, you could see the astonishment. But in 2005, China didn't even understand how global markets operated in terms of prices going up, investment and resources. It takes a long time for production capacity to expand. But when it does, supply expands and prices go down. And that's exactly what happened in iron ore. But we had, and I recount an episode in the book where the very smart and suave Chinese ambassador Fu Ying went into Alexander Downer's office one day and was banging the desk telling Downer that the Australian government was exploiting China and had to tell the companies to cut iron ore prices. Now, can you imagine trying that on with a liberal economist like Alexander Downer, let alone anyone else? And we saw a good taste, and we had a good taste of wolf warrior diplomacy at that time as well. It didn't start this year, I can assure you. So, look, that was a huge strategic shock. And many strategic analysts in Beijing think of this resource and energy dependency as being the boot on China's throat. And in many ways, this underlies the origins of the BRI. The BRI's developed as something different, but that was the origin of it, to provide alternative sources of supply of energy that did not have to go through the South China Sea or the Straits of Malacca. And you can see the strategic interest of the Straits of Malacca and South China Sea. Finally, the other constraint is soft power. And we can talk about that later perhaps, but basically just to get that issue ticked off, China's capacity to limit soft power is very constrained by the fact that soft power has to go through the Communist Party's narrative, and that doesn't sell very well overseas. But just to round off this, and perhaps I've been a bit long in my answer, James, it's also the way China's grand strategy, as I argue in the book, is derived from weakness, not strength. And when the Communist Party finally took over China in 1949, they didn't inherit a state or a nation they inherited a fragmented territory. And there's a great book that's come out recently by a guy called Khan, who talks about haunted by chaos. And that underlies, I think, the psychology around the absolute unquestioned focus on territorial integrity and the survival of the Communist Party, and each is seen as reinforcing each other. So I might leave it at that.
Thanks, Geoff. And indeed, we're going to get back to some of those issues in terms of the modern China being born out of chaos and the Communist Party's focus on its vulnerabilities. Geoff, Malcolm Turnbull, Australia's former Prime Minister, he used to like to say that the threats Australia faced were a combination of capability and intent. Now, your first answer argues that the capabilities China has, potentially, to threaten Australia are perhaps more, they're more limited than many people indicate. Let's talk about intent as well, because this is another thing that struck me from reading your book. Most weeks I'm reading the front pages of Australian newspapers, and the intent they ascribe to China is a pretty negative one. But let me quote you. On page 18, you write, well, you say very matter-of-factly, you say, oh, well, a more assertive foreign policy from China should have been anticipated as its economy and power grew commensurately. The page before that, you note, and I learnt something here, you note that democratic Taiwan matches the PRC's territorial claims in the South China Sea. That I did know, but then you add, and in Tibet and Xinjiang, while actually being more expansionist in Mongolia and other parts of Central Asia. So the argument there is China's just sort of doing what a lot of great powers do in terms of being more assertive. And let's not get too hung up on China being unique, because here we have democratic Taiwan that actually is actually more expansionist in some senses, at least in terms of its claims. Now, Geoff, let me push back. I can imagine a critic coming along and saying, well, hang on, Geoff Raby, there is nothing benign or normal or expected about a state that detains in an extrajudicial fashion hundreds of thousands of its own citizens in re-education camps. There's nothing normal, expected, or benign about a state that engages in hostage diplomacy. Actually, let me put to you a critique, Geoff, that I read in last weekend's Australian, so you can answer it directly. It's from Paul Monk, a former officer in the Australian Defence Intelligence Organisation, the head of their China desk. Paul says this, commenting on your book. I guess he got an advance copy. He says, there are two crucial flaws in his argument. That's your argument. Paul says, Geoff Raby concedes openly that China under Xi Jinping is a mercantilist, revisionist and totalitarian power, but thinks it is not a threat to us, because its dependency on resource imports and export markets are a nightmare for its strategic planners. Stunningly, Paul says, he fails to grasp that this is precisely why China is so rapidly building up its naval and expeditionary power, and President Xi is talking up the importance of readiness for war. Our reasons for concern about this are palpable. Geoff Raby, your response.
Thanks, James. Look, on the first, there are two elements here you're putting together. The first is, I don't use the word benign, and be clear about that. And what I'm talking about is that great powers behave as they wish. And great powers have a tendency to not behave well all of the time as they pursue their interests. And I think if you were an Iraqi, or someone in Venezuela or whatever in the past, or you could think of other great powers who haven't behaved all that well at times. So it is just really a statement of historical fact. The great powers are dominant, pushy, abrasive, and pursue their interests ruthlessly. If you're a citizen of a great power, that's what you'd expect them to do. You'd want them to do that. I think it mixes things up a bit when you introduce Xinjiang and so on. I mean, it's a dreadful situation in Xinjiang. It needs to be called out. But it is Chinese sovereign territory. Doesn't excuse the behaviour, but it's different than engaging with other states. And that's also the dilemma we have over Hong Kong. Terrible dilemma for people from democratic countries to witness this, but Hong Kong is part of the sovereign state of China, and it was handed over by the colonial British power to the communists in 1997. Then they're coming on to Paul Monk's point. It's like everything in the world's possible. And it is possible that China may one day want to occupy the Pilbara and get its iron ore at a secure supply of iron ore. I don't think when you are facing forward deployment of 4 aircraft carrier fleets from the United States, plus Japan with your deep historical animosities and conflict with India, or potential conflict with India, that you're building up your military forces in order to occupy the Pilbara. Paul might be onto something, he might have an insight there, but I think with strategic planning and policy assessments, you really do need to not talk about possibilities, because everything in life is possible in a sense. It's probabilities. And I would attach a very, very low probability on China's building its force projection capacity to occupy the Pilbara, rather than just continue to buy iron ore on open markets and encourage very efficient producers to supply at the lowest possible price. And what China will do, though, and is doing, is promoting alternative sources of supply to Australia. It doesn't need to occupy the Pilbara. It needs to get Brazil sorted out and get Vale iron ore back into the market, get its Xanadu Guinea project up and running, and many other things. They're all cheaper, more efficient and safer options. So I think Paul is drawing a very, very long bow on that point.
Thanks, Geoff. Now, here's another big idea in your book. I think most Australians would be comfortable with the idea that a US military presence in our region has been good for Australia. Now, you say that too, but you also add, well, let me quote you so I don't get this wrong. You say, Australia's region has been more stable and prosperous than at any time in the past 200 years. And then I think what is crucial is the next sentence. You say this is not only because of the US military presence, but also because of China's economic development and its internal political stability. Now, it's not often these days that you read about China's power, which derives from its prosperity, and certainly not in the context of the Chinese Communist Party's firm grip on power, that you hear that presented as part of the reason why Australia's region is stable. Doubly so after COVID-19. I recall on July 1st, Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, said, and I'll quote him, "We need to also prepare for a post-COVID world that is poorer, that is more dangerous, and that is more disorderly." I mean, I think that's more of the normal thing we read about in Australian newspapers. So can you elaborate on what leads you to this assessment? And I guess another question that I have that I'd like you to discuss is US military presence in the region a necessary condition for Australian stability? Or put that a bit differently, if the US military left tomorrow and Australia was simply in a region with a prosperous China, would we still be okay, or would we be in big trouble without that US military presence?
Yeah, there's 3 elements to that, and please pick me up if I forget to touch on each of the 3 elements. I'll take the comments by Prime Minister Morrison first. If you recall, I did an AFR column welcoming Morrison's statement and saying that finally we're starting to resolve the contradictions at the heart of Australian foreign policy, which has dogged foreign policy in Australia for the past 4 or 5 years or longer. We are going to live in a more dangerous world. The US will not be able or willing to guarantee peace and stability to the level and to the extent that it has for the post-war period. And the last, third part of my book is actually called Australia's Dystopian Future. for precisely that reason. And I go into how we need to try and navigate our foreign policy and achieve our security and advance our interests in an increasingly dystopic world for a country that has liberal democratic values, that lives in a region where the dominant power is an authoritarian power, and where there are states of very many different degrees of authoritarianism and competitive political organisation across the spectrum. So your other point about, the second point, last point about, or the last point rather, wasn't about US presence in the region for stability. I fully agree, and it's going to be an even more dystopic future if the US were just to suddenly pack up and go home, but they're not going to. They've got geopolitical and economic interests that are substantial, and they're going to be continue to be a major presence and a source of peace and stability in the region for a long time to come. Again, it's a bit like what I said in response to Paul Monk's comment. You know, everything's possible, but in terms of probability, I don't think we have to worry about the US packing up and leaving, but the nature and type of its engagement will exercise and should exercise Australian foreign policy makers. And we do need to seek to engage the US constantly. And if you look at the book, I have 10 points on which to base a foreign policy for a dystopic future. And point number 1 or 2 is continuing US presence in the region. Now, James, I think I've forgotten your first point, and I thought that might happen. I haven't been done. You remember it?
Well, let me follow up with what's going through my head right now. So you acknowledge that Australia faces a dystopic future, but you're still clear on the point that a prosperous China, one with internal political stability, which means a Chinese Communist Party with its hands firmly on the levers of power, you think that's in Australia's interests. Is that right?
No, you're verbling me. Stability in China is in not only Australia's, but the region's interests. How that stability is achieved through the Communist Party or some other mechanism, I couldn't care less. I mean, you prefer it to be some other mechanism, but it is what it is. And that's the point. You know, you can only deal with the reality you've got, or to shift metaphors, you can only deal with the hand of cards you've been dealt. We're dealing with a dominant, powerful, assertive China run by the Communist Party. Would it be dominant and powerful if it was run by a democratic country, a party? I don't know. But you did remember that I had that point about Taiwan's territorial expansion. So democracy and modest international objectives and agendas are not necessarily always coming together. But no, look, the point I was making is a simple one, really, on your very first point, and that is it's a counterfactual. Imagine if China didn't have internal political stability. And in many ways, that's what we encountered when China began its open door policy and we started to engage China. And ultimately, my book is really about, is an argument for engagement, not containment. And when we engaged China in the early 80s, it was an inward-looking, poor, suspicious, hostile country that was cultivating revolutionary movements throughout Southeast Asia, was interfering in other countries' internal affairs in support of communist insurrection. And the region was very dangerous, very unstable, and having a stable China prevents instability around China's massive borders and in the East Asian region. Equally, you know, in the 70s, we had to deal with massive refugee outflow from Cambodia and Vietnam. And to the credit of the liberal conservative government of the time, they showed a great deal of generosity, and we dealt with that as other countries in the region had to deal with it. Imagine economic collapse in China and what the outflow of refugees would be like. So you've got to apply a counterfactual to that point. And that's really what I was doing in that section.
Thanks, Geoff. Well, let me continue with my questioning, hopefully not verbaling you with the next one. But I do want to, you know, let's keep with the tough questioning. I think that's what our audience will want. Now, let's return to something you mentioned earlier. where you said that a lot of China's grand strategy was a strategy that is born out of weakness. And to quote you here, something you mentioned before, you say, Mao Zedong, at the foundation of the People's Republic in 1949, Mao did not win the state, but rather inherited a China shattered into many pieces. The Communist Party of China had to make a state out of the rubble it had acquired. So that points to this deep sense of vulnerability that folks in China feel. Now, Geoff, I think it's one thing to point out that from China's perspective, it's important that Western audiences display some sensitivity towards that. At the very least, it's a pretty pragmatic negotiating strategy to understand how your counterpart thinks. But Geoff, I can't imagine some people coming along and saying, look, how far do we take this? I mean, just simply by virtue of being a liberal democracy, expressing or not rolling over on values, asserting our interests, isn't China just going to get angry at us no matter what we do? I mean, I think we have seen some times in recent years where China seems to me to verge on the paranoid. We saw in Hong Kong, for example, the narrative about how those Hong Kong protests were orchestrated by black hands, foreign forces. Now, it's probably fair to say that maybe the United States did have something to do with it, but surely overwhelmingly, this was coming from Hong Kong residents. So what would your argument be to that? That, look, we can't be too sensitive about this because China gets sensitive about everything.
Well, look, specifically on Hong Kong, just to get that to one side, in the book, I deal with Hong Kong and say that really Beijing lost Hong Kong. I reflect on the fact that in 1997, when I was giving a speech at the night of the handover to an IBM delegation, it was palpable the joy and enthusiasm and embrace by young, in particular, Hong Kong people, that they were moving from a colonial power running Hong Kong to being handed back to China, run by a communist party. Now, they may not know what they were getting in for, but the point is there was a sense of national identity. They were finally getting a Chinese identity and they embraced it. And 20 years later, that's obviously no longer the case. And that's why I would say it's sort of Chinese ineptitude that Beijing's ineptitude, that Beijing has essentially lost Hong Kong. I don't think it had to be this way, but here it is. It is. Really, it's the point about understanding where the Communist Party comes from as China's government is to actually try and see through its eyes what its strategic challenges are. And that's about how we shape our diplomatic response and what are sensitivities and what are not, and how we manage our message and so on. So I think that's really the key point that I'm making there. And your quote was actually not me, but Han, who I quoted, who I think is a very fine book and very helpful in thinking about these things. But your real point is, how do we, with our differences with China, deal with them? And as I've often said, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean you're not being followed. Beijing is absolutely paranoid, but there's a bit of history there. And it wouldn't hurt occasionally for Western strategic thinkers and policymakers and media to remember that the Communist Party has a lot of reasons to feel paranoid, even if its behaviour exceeds the justification that may be there. So look, how do we deal with China? You have to deal with the party state from a position of firmness, but also I think we have no choice, and we have done so for 50 years, or however longer now, gosh, 70 years. We have acknowledged that it is the government of China, and that we don't actually recognize governments, we recognize states, and that's what we're dealing with. And so we have to deal with the party state from a position of firmness. And we have to stick, obviously, to our values, but we've been dealing with the party state for a very, very long time. And we haven't resolved from our values. I used to chair the Australia-China bilateral human rights dialogue. Now, some people, impatient people, will say, well, it didn't achieve very much. But it actually did make progress in some areas. And it was a mechanism by which we could have an orderly and regular and ongoing discussion with China about its human rights practices. And so they could never be anything other than completely aware of our position on these issues. They are in any case, but it was a useful mechanism for reinforcing that. So I think that's really, you know, my comments on that question, James, really is we have to deal from a position of firmness, but it doesn't mean antagonism or confrontation. It also means that dealing with China requires us to recognize what the historical conditions have been that have formed the positions China's taking today. I mean, what China's doing today just doesn't appear in the abstract. It comes from a set of historical and political conditions.
Thanks, Geoff. Look, I'm conscious that we want to go to our audience soon, but there's two quick questions I'd like to ask you. Actually, they're probably not so quick because they're actually quite big questions, but they're really focused on the Australia-China relationship, which is the second part of your book after you've covered China's green strategy. So let's focus on that. Geoff, in a recent article, John Fitzgerald from Swinburne University, another noted Australian-China scholar, he began an article by disabusing the notion that the source of Australia-China tensions currently is the United States under President Trump. Now, I think reading your book, you would actually agree with John on that point. This has a much bigger backstory. The current tensions, that is, has a much bigger backstory than just Donald Trump. I'll just quickly quote Professor Fitzgerald here. He says, in my assessment, formal relations, that is between Australia and China, started to deteriorate when China declared an air defence identification zone in 2013. It then progressively occupied and militarised contested islands in the South China Sea and laid claims to waters within its fabulous 9-dashed line. So the date is November 2013. And China's provocations really kicked things off. Now, when reading your book, I got the impression you were focused on November 2011, which of course is when Barack Obama came to Australia and announced his pivot foreign policy. So is that where, just to confirm, is that the date, November 2011, kicked off by the United States, where that you trace a lot of the current tensions we're experiencing to?
Yeah, I guess it's the sort of historian in me that wouldn't pin it down so precisely, but it is a key event. It's a head-turning event, right? And it certainly predates the air defence notification zone. And of course, remember, as a gushing Julia Gillard stood next to Barack Obama in Darwin as he announced the pivot, which is the Obama foreign policy doctrine. She also enthusiastically announced new forward US Marine troop rotations through Darwin. Now, you know, I wrote at the time, China would be delighted with that because it just meant fewer troops in South Korea, much closer to China. And Darwin's a long way from anywhere much. So it's not the actual strategic substance. It's about imaging and messaging. And the messaging was very, very clear. And yeah, and then China has responded in its own way. And it was a big hullabaloo about the air identification zone at the time. It was going to be the end of all air flight navigation safely through the region. And nothing much has ever seemed to happen since then. And I don't even think I mentioned in my book. I think that's a sin of omission. And if I ever get a chance at another edition, I'll have to stick it in, thanks to John. But these things often don't have a great deal of strategic substance, but the diplomacy and the messaging is hugely influential. And of course, in both places, both in China, people think of China as this sort of horrible authoritarian, one-party state. run by, you know, propaganda department and so on. But all this stuff gets played out in the news in China as well and becomes hot subjects for internal political debate, and the academics all pick it up and the think tanks, just like it does in our societies. Obviously, the difference is that the party runs a filter over it in China all the time, where it doesn't happen with us, of course. But that's why this messaging plays out in both societies, both the Western societies or within China, sometimes in very powerful ways, and shapes policy.
Thanks, Geoff. Okay, last quick question from me, then we'll go to our audience. Now, here's another big idea in your book, or a big claim in your book, and that is that Australia has it's shifted from strategic cooperation with China towards one of strategic competition. You note that while the foreign policy, 2017 foreign policy white paper might talk about the sustainment of cooperative, mutually beneficial relations, in fact, you said, pretty sure I'm quoting you directly here, not someone else, in retrospect, the white paper now appears to have been a diversion from the Australian government's real policy intention, which was to align itself even more closely with China's strategic competitors to contain China. Now, if Scott Morrison was here, he'd say, hang on, Dr. Raby, I've been very clear about this. Australia welcomes China's economic rise. It's not about containment. So what would be your response?
Well, yeah, sure. We welcome China's economic rise as long as they're buying stuff from us and not doing anything else. But yeah, that's just unrealistic, and the world doesn't work that way. And it's a good point you raise. And again, I would put it more in the space, more in the realm of what I was talking about, of diplomatic messaging, intended or otherwise. And that is one of my critiques of Australian, of how we manage the Australia-China relationship. That much of the messaging has been woeful. It didn't have to be, and it didn't have to be at the cost of what our real strategic and security interests are. So things like Australia's enthusiastic support for the Quad, and I've written about this in the AFR on many occasions. And look, what has never been answered is the Quad consists of three of China's strategic competitors: the US, clear, and since 2017, unambiguously so, and even more so under Secretary of State Pompeo, who said that the Quad is not only about containing China, it's about putting China back in its rightful place. This is very aggressive language. And so we're part of that. And then there's Japan, which is a strategic competitor of China, although much more nuanced in what it says, and India. It's always been a curiosity to me, and I still don't really understand why we see it's in our interests to be such an enthusiastic supporter of a group that consists only of China's strategic competitors, when China is not our strategic competitor. It is not a strategic threat to Australia. We have no history of unresolved issues like Japan and India does. And we're not a great power that's being challenged by China's ascendancy like the United States is. And if it is a dialogue of democracies, as we sometimes try and fudge it, and let's all get together and have a talk about democracy, great idea, we love that. But then why aren't other regional democracies involved? Why isn't South Korea or Indonesia or the Philippines? I mean, these are vibrant democracies who are excluded from a dialogue of democracies in the region. The agenda is one of containing China, even if until Pompeo, no one was prepared to call it for what it was. And I'm not saying it, Pompeo is saying it, US Secretary of State. I'm very grateful that he did, but he has. And then the overweening anxiousness of Australian defence people to be part of the Malabar exercises. And we're pushed and pushed and pushed. We had one day in the sun in 2007, along with Singapore, mind you, and then nothing ever since. And we pushed and pushed and pushed. Finally, the last couple of weeks, India's agreed, probably, I believe, because of the dispute in Ladakh recently and the fighting on the border of Ladakh. And this is the way India will use us to push back on China on a bilateral issue, not on any broad Indo-Pacific balancing China, but on a very specific bilateral issue between India and China. The list can go on. With the announcement of Huawei, for example, Australia was the first and the only one for a long time, even before the United States, that had announced a fully comprehensive ban on Huawei participating in 5G. If our security depended on that, fine, do it. But don't make it a badge of honour that you've stood up and banned Huawei comprehensively before anyone else. It's not a badge of honour to get out in front of the pack, like we did also on criticising China after the Hague Court of Justice decision came out, when we had the most strident voice by far on the South China Sea. We have to adopt nuanced, sophisticated diplomacy. We should not be looking for awards or a pat on the head for being aggressive against the ascendant power. We have to position ourselves. Finally on this, there are consequences. We have managed to maneuver ourselves into the position of being an outlier. Many, many countries in Europe are starting to get mightily irritated with China's behaviour. Countries in Southeast Asia are at the very forefront of it. None has manoeuvred themselves into a position where they have no official contact any longer. We have successfully made ourselves an outlier. And I don't think that was necessary. And hopefully we can find a way back and take a firm position against China on issues that really matter for us and really be smart about selecting what those issues are, but work in like-minded coalitions to hedge China, not contain. There's a very significant difference, I think, is lost in the public debate in Australia between containment and hedging.
Okay, let's continue now with a question from our audience. This is from Glenda Corporal. You would know Glenda from the Australian newspaper, their former China correspondent. Look, Glenda asks a question, Geoff, that I think is on everyone's lips, and that is, has the relationship between Australia and China got to an irretrievable situation? She also asks, what are the long-term implications for Australia trade ties of the current situation? But how about we focus on that first part? I mean, are we now in an irretrievable situation?
No, we're in a difficult position, and difficult for both sides. It's not just a thing for Australia to deal with. China's got to deal with it itself. I do think that China, a couple of weeks ago, through the speech made at the National Press Club by the Deputy Head of Mission at the Chinese Embassy, Wang Xining, was conciliatory, and I do think that the written comments that former Ambassador to Australia, Madame Fu Ying, made to the AFR were conciliatory. I haven't seen any public acknowledgement that there may have been something conciliatory about that. I don't think that would be a backward step by Australia to do that. But no, the Chinese are terribly pragmatic about these things, and it's about interests. And I hope that we focus more on interests than ideology. If we do focus on our interests, we can find a way back from here. And a couple of conciliatory statements by the Australian Prime Minister, carefully graduated, depending on, or calibrated rather, depending on the Chinese response, wouldn't cost us anything and may actually provide a pathway to something of a more normal relationship.
Geoff, here's another question from Lisa Dwyer that I think is also on everyone's lips. Gee, it's hard to keep up with allegations of Chinese economic coercion directed at Australia. Today we've had wood, yesterday it was lobster, before that it was cotton. We all know there's issues around wine, barley, beef, and so on. Lisa asks, how should the Australian government and Australian agricultural producers respond to those incidents? You're a former ambassador. You would have thought about this before. What would your advice be?
Well, and I'm a former ambassador to the WTO. And I think first and foremost, that is the only response that small countries like Australia have, is recourse to the rules. It's a great pity that the United States has been so comprehensively putting a scythe through the WTO and making it much more difficult for that organisation to work, including not appointing appellate body judges. So we don't have many options to respond. There seems to be, and I'm only following the public discussion, various statements coming from different parts of industry and government. Whether there's any basis to the trade measures, I don't know. But of course, for China, economic coercion is a part of China's statecraft. And I think it's more prominent for China, to put this in a bigger context, because China actually doesn't have many other means by which it can influence and assert, or believe that it can influence and assert, exercise influence over other countries. I mentioned before the absence of soft power, its inability to project force. Economic coercion comes to mind for the Chinese leadership because guess what? It's the biggest market in the world. And the Chinese leadership absolutely believe that that's the main power they have, is denying access to their market. And so it is a huge vulnerability. The problem is, for Australia, is that our living standards have grown very much on the basis of our trade with China. And you've done some very good work, James, on all of this issue. Your zero economy work has demonstrated that there are very real and good reasons why we are so dependent on the Chinese economy, and why if we tried to force any sort of diversification, which is perfectly reasonable if a government wants to do that on the grounds of national security, for example, there's going to be a very big hit to national living standards, and we need to be very upfront and clear about that. There will be a big cost to Australia's economic welfare if somehow we try to force diversification away on the basis of strategic considerations. But we may choose to do it, and it might be perfectly legitimate to do it. I'm not arguing against it. I'm just saying what it all means. But I do think ultimately the best way is to try and minimise friction in the relationship, whatever our differences are, and certainly to have a relationship in which ministers can talk to their counterparts and officials can go in and see their counterparts, and we can establish whether it is without basis or whether there is some basis that we can work through in a sensible, orderly way.
Geoff, most people's minds gravitate to the present, and we're all quite fond in the Australia-China space of trying to read the tea leaves. I have a question here from Yuan Jiang. He's a PhD student from Queensland University of Technology. And I thought a few people might have this one. He notes that the Chinese Consul General position in Sydney was abruptly vacated in June, but it's since been filled quite quickly. He asks, in your view, is that a positive signal for bilateral relations, that China saw it as being a priority to make sure that position was filled in a very short period of time?
I'm not sure of the premise of the question, that I necessarily agree that it was vacated abruptly. I know the former Consul General, and we had a farewell call, and his successor was already known and in the system. So I wouldn't read anything into that. I certainly, I mean, there may be something more that I don't know. I interpret it as a normal rotation of bureaucratic positions.
I guess one positive we could take is it certainly contrasts to the American ambassador position, which was vacated for, I think it was 2 years, if I recall correctly. Okay, Geoff, my colleague at the Australian National University, I guess you know her as well, Professor Jane Golly, she likes to talk about contention and consensus. So just a very quick question, we're in our last 5 minutes, but when you look at the Australian government's handling of the China relationship now, what do you think they've got right and you would suggest that they continue with? But where do you think some significant change is desperately needed, and what forms do you think that should take? I know it's a big question, but if you can narrow down a few priorities on each side, that'd be great.
individual policy measures we take, banning Huawei or whatever, are done in terms of our own national security and sovereignty, and that's perfectly legitimate to do it. I made the point how we present it is a big issue, and it's a variable we can control. Just like anti-foreign interference, as I've said constantly about it, we should have had it years ago. The issue should have been, why hadn't the politicians acted earlier and brought in an anti-foreign interference law? It should be welcomed and supported, but it didn't have to be presented by the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull speaking some phrase in Mandarin, which basically not only suggested this was an issue about Chinese influence, not influence on a non-discriminatory basis, which is what it is and should be presented as. The presentation was all about China, deliberately and unambiguously. And the phrase he used, translated to English, that the Australian people had stood up, paraphrased Mao Zedong's apparent statement that the Chinese people had stood up when he founded the People's Republic of China. But they had stood up against 100 years of colonial repression. And we can't deny the colonial history. And people in China, when they heard that, my friends and things, I was there at the time, were really shocked. So what is going on in Australia? So these things matter a lot because we're talking, James, always about diplomacy. But I'd like to see us just return to one other element of that, but we never say anything positive about the relationship these days. And again, we're not being supine and we're not trading off national sovereignty to say positive things about the relationship and our engagement with China. And there are many things we need to engage with China constructively on, and we do, multilaterally, regionally. I know we're working with China in the WTO for rejigging the dispute settlement mechanism because of US disruption. There are many things. We need to talk more about the positive aspect of the relationship. Finally, I'd just say, look, we could get back to the Howard formula, if you like, and that is to recognize we have substantial differences, but we have enormous interests in common that we can pursue. And I think that's a very pragmatic formula that the Chinese would understand and recognize. And the last point on that is, as a very concrete, specific proposal, you'll recall in 2009, October 2009, when another period when the relationship was in a rapid downward spiral, and Canberra was being more hairy-chested. The game in Canberra was to be the most hairy-chested on China, and all the bureaucratic rewards were going to those who could be the toughest and talk the toughest language and background the media accordingly. The Chinese decided to put a floor under the downward spiral. They sent, at very short notice, Vice Premier Li Keqiang to Canberra. He sat down with Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and they negotiated an understanding on the management of the relationship, which I think still is very valuable today. And one concrete step Australia could do would be to have some of our senior ministers just speculating about maybe it's time to revisit that understanding. Maybe it needs to be updated. And that could open a conversation to how we might get back and start formal ministerial level contact.
Geoff Raby, many thanks for your time. Just our audience, one more time. Geoff's book, we've only been able to give you a taste today, but I hope it was a substantial taste. Please do go out and buy the book. Geoff Raby, thanks for joining us today.
A pleasure, James. Thanks again for having me.
Let me now go to my colleague, Michael Joel, to wrap things up.
Thank you, James and Geoff. As James has mentioned, Dr. Raby's book, China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New Global Order, is now available to order as both a paperback and ebook at Melbourne University Publishing's website, mep.com.au. Members of the audience will be sending an email to everyone here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it, and we can make future UTS ACRI events a better experience for everyone involved. If you wanted to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about our research, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. The discussion today will also be available there. Please follow us on Twitter for the latest news at ACRI_UTS. Thanks again to our speakers, Professor James Lawrenson and Geoff Raby, and thank you to all of our attendees. See you next time.